good evening once again, or good morning. Welcome to the other side of midnight, that magical time between midnight and dawn when, well, on the show, a lot of interesting things can happen. I have a couple things I want to do before we get into our guest, who is really extraordinarily intriguing, and we haven't had an in-depth conversation in literally decades, and I'll explain what that means in a few moments. But first, what I want to do is to hit a couple of things that have happened over the weekend that I promised you on Friday. One is, if you go to the top of the Other Side of Midnight page, othersideofmidnight.com. Now, there's a slight confusion because many years ago there was a book written by, I believe, Sidney Sheldon called The Other Side of Midnight. That's not the website you want. We could only get Other Side of Midnight, not to conflict with the novel. So when you go looking on the web for us, you have to look for othersideofmidnight.com. But I usually colloquially use the, so that has caused some confusion, and I wanted to clear that up, and I guess I hopefully have done that. So anyway, if you go to the other side, see, I did it again, othersideofmidnight.com webpage, at the very top on the right-hand side, you will see a new entry marked Fan Art Gallery. And if you click on that, it will take you to two submissions. We had a very interesting charcoal sketch done of me doing the broadcast by a very talented guy named Andrew Curry. Well, Mr. Curry has submitted something else, which is up there tonight. It's called a sci-fi surface, and it is a depiction in 3 dimensions, as seen from the ground, of some of the arcologies, the mega arcologies that Keith and Steve and some of my other guests have been describing on these images from the New Horizons mission coming in over the last several weeks. So if you go to the Fan Art Gallery and you click on that and you scroll down, you'll see Andrew's really fascinating look. And you can click on the image and it'll take you to a much higher version which you can download and print out and put on your wall. And what I want to do is I actually want to do a comparison for the series that Lainey and I are doing on the arcologies, because I think what would help would be a side-by-side view of Andrew's perspective if you're standing in a spacesuit at 400 below zero Fahrenheit. Imagine the insulation on the soles of that boot. And you're looking at these things, having landed in some really neat spaceship, and then to compare them with the orbital imagery looking down from the New Horizons cameras, because it's eerie. Apparently Andrew had not seen the close-ups that I sent him later, because when I was in touch with him, he sent back an email saying, oh my God, wow, because his art of what these things look like was taken directly, apparently, from the verbal descriptions that I and Keith Laney and Bob Harrison and some others have had over the last several days as to what these things would look like if you were standing there. I mean, the Pluto mission to me represents, after literally half a century, an extraordinary waypoint, an extraordinary opportunity that we need to take advantage of if we're going to get all the data in a timely fashion, and if we can kind of urge them, all of us who are here collectively on the radio tonight, after midnight, we can make a difference. Remember years ago when Art and I were doing shows on, I guess in the late 90s, we were able to, with the audience, actually pressure Mike Malin, who was the principal investigator on the camera on Mars Surveyor. We were actually able to pressure him to put out some decent images of the face, and that changed the entire dialogue and the thrust of the investigation and made it a household word when all the networks picked up on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So do not underestimate the collective political ability of us to exert meaningful influences if we, in fact, direct our attention to the right places. On that note, I want to give you a report on some things that we discussed on Friday that are kind of in transition. We discussed actually creating a White House petition for the Pluto imagery to basically start a petition that would accumulate signatures and would force this administration to formally respond to the idea that they've been not too forthcoming on some of the most extraordinary images. I mean, the idea that from now till the end of August, till September, they're only going to be sending particles and fields data and, the measurements in the vicinity of Pluto in terms of non-imaging. I mean, does that really make sense? If you have a spacecraft which has all of your data loaded on the solid state recorders on board, and at any moment something could happen, a cosmic ray hitting the wrong part of the computers, a mechanical breakdown in the fuel lines, pressure regulator from the helium tanks, whatever. That spacecraft has a limited life, even though some people are projecting that it could last as long as 20 years. You never really know that. We've had spacecraft that have been fine one day, and people at the DSN have looked for them the next day on the regular pass, and nothing, zero, zip. Something happened, and there was no telemetry and no engineering, and we will never know what happened. That actually happened to Mars Odyssey, if you'll remember. That was a spacecraft which was supposed to go into orbit around Mars in the early 90s, and they went out of communications just before a turn and a burn to go into orbit, and nothing was ever heard publicly after. If that in fact were to occur, then the 95% or so of the data that they took that's still on board would never get home. So to me, the rationale, the logical rationale for sending relatively low priority data when it's the images that will tell us about the geology and the internal energy sources and the atmospheric effects and, of course, the structures, the artifacts, the ruins, that data absolutely had to have been prioritized and sent home first in the hours and hours and hours right after closest approach. So the fact that it's on the ground, by all logic, it's on the ground, and they're not showing it to us, they're not holding press conferences, they're claiming they don't have it, means there's a reason to create a petition at the White House to basically demand, after 50 years, access to our damn data. No more excuses, no more we're going to save it for the papers. We pay the salaries of all the people who are writing the papers using our data that we pay for. So why can't we get a chance to look at it? I mean, the standard excuse is that, well, they don't want scientists to scoop them. They don't want scientists to scoop them. They've spent, 10 years en route, and if you throw in a few more years, let's say another 5 for development and plans and proposals and the NASA bureaucracy, and you get to fly instruments on this spacecraft, and you get the data, and the inclination is to say, well, they deserve to have a proprietary period because they invested all this time and effort and grad students and won the grants and the ability to actually perform the mission. They deserve priority. The fact is that the only priority that this system is preserving is the priority not to show the American people what they photographed. Because since the scientific community is so incredibly closely knit, and there are only like a handful of kind of significant or major scientific journals where you can publish stuff that's of historical, epic, paradigm-breaking value, and it will have an impact on the world, is what? Science, Nature, there's just a few others. So all you would have to do is to basically tell the editors of these scientific peer-reviewed journals that if they get a paper on Pluto or Mars or whatever the planet of the week is, from anybody who's not on the team, they simply don't accept it. In other words, you have a built-in criteria to accept in priority papers on the missions from the scientists doing the missions. And any other scientists that wanted to publish, well, they could put it on their website. They could put it, on YouTube. They could, put it on their Facebook page. But it wouldn't have the validation or the credibility or the scientific import of a peer-reviewed scientific process. So that way you could have your cake and eat it too. You could reserve the right for the scientists to publish their peer-reviewed studies in the appropriate journals, and at the same time, you get a chance to show the people who actually made it possible for you to publish in the scientific journals what it is that they paid for. And that's why we're looking seriously at creating a White House petition. Probably it should be larger. It should think bigger than just the Pluto mission, because this has been a systemic problem with NASA for many, many years, and it's an even worse problem with some other space agencies. But of course, the only people that we can really directly affect politically with our influence and our emails and our letting them know that we're watching is, of course, the folks that are paid by NASA, because we are their ultimate bosses. Now, let me give you a little preview of what's coming up the rest of the week. I'm really looking forward to Thursday. I had a conversation with Art about this, and he was, how should I say, he was less than over the rainbow enthusiastic about my idea. What I'm going to try to do on Friday morning show, which is the show that follows the debate. In fact, if I've looked at some of the news plans for some of the networks, they're planning still to be narrating and discussing and having panels on the debate, even as we go on the air at 1 o'clock in the morning Mountain Time, midnight on the Pacific, and stay on for 2 hours. So what I'm doing is I'm assembling a small panel. I've got an editor, friend of mine, who has some very eclectic ideas on the world and environment and politics and what's working and what's not working. He's in Hong Kong, so with the advantage of Skype, we're going to be able to bring him in like he was literally sitting here across the desk from me here in the Land of Enchantment tonight, where there is a gorgeous gibbous moon, which is shining down on the sandias and the deserts and the scrub and the coyotes and the rabbits and all the other stuff that's going on out there that we can't see because it's kind of dark. Anyway, so he's coming in to us from Hong Kong. And then another friend of mine who is a politician, I almost hate to use that term. He's different than a politician. He's a representative. He's actually run for Congress. He has been chairman of the Libertarian, and there goes that phone again. He is chairman of the, what is it that I want? He is chairman of the Libertarian National Committee. In fact, it was through some of his offices that I got an invite to speak to their convention a couple, 3 years ago up in Denver. And he does many, many other interesting things. And again, he has a very outside-the-box perspective on this coming election. The election itself, the election process, is so extraordinarily interesting. Apart from the standard left-right, Democrat, Republican, everybody, making claims about everybody else, this is an extraordinary time to be alive. So what we're going to do on Friday morning is we're going to talk about the debate from the perspective of a different side, the other side of the debate. And I don't know any more than that, so we will just have to see. So, without any further ado, I think that takes care of all the business that I wanted to get into. I want to introduce you this morning to a very old and valued friend, someone who, frankly, I haven't had a chance to talk to for, I think we were saying it was going on 30 years, whatever. Anyway, my guest is Dr. John Brandenburg. He is a plasma physicist, theoretical physicist, who was born in Rochester, Minnesota, grew up in Medford, Oregon. He obtained his BA in physics and a mathematics minor from Southern Oregon University, and then an MS in 77 and a PhD in plasma physics at the University of California, Davis in 81. The way I met John is that when I looked at the first images of Mars from Viking, particularly that Cydonia region, one of the things that struck me was the size and the depth and the scale of the craters appeared wrong. There are mostly impact scars and craters all over the solar system from various objects hitting other objects and causing a great explosion because of the kinetic energy. These craters on Mars at Cydonia appeared to have a different depth to size ratio. They appeared to be different. So I remember that out of the blue, I called up John because he'd been at Los Alamos and he had a rep, and I think he was referred to me by somebody else. Anyway, we wound up having a conversation about the eerie possibility that the craters at Cydonia could in fact be the remnants of an ancient nuclear war. Now we flash forward the film, and one of the things we're going to talk about on this summer evening in 2015 is one of John's latest books, which happens to consider exactly that issue. Is it possible there was an ancient nuclear war on Mars? So without further ado, let me introduce my old dear friend and colleague, John Brandenburg. John, good evening or good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Richard. Great to be here.
What time is it?
Here talking to you after all these years.
Oh my God, it is embarrassing how long it's been since I think we kind of passed each other in the night on Coast a few times.
Oh yeah, well, I remember I was going to come and join you for dinner one night, and then there was a blizzard. I was coming down from Los Alamos, and I was going to join you in Albuquerque, and there was a blizzard. They blocked the highway, so I ended up having to spend a night at a hotel at Santa Fe. So
they do that here in New Mexico. I was
amazed how the police just blocked the highway, said go back, and I said the road behind us is snowy too. What are we supposed to do? And he said that's not my problem.
He really said that.
What's that?
He really said that.
He basically just said, go where I'm pointing.
My. So where should we begin? We have such a... Well, let me flip ahead in the story. So after the conversation and John, answers and his willingness to consider the unthinkable, mm-hmm. I added you, to the Independent Mars Investigation Team out of SRI, and that, as that movie says, was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It was,
because we did a really good job. We basically validated the work of Vince DiPietro and Greg Molinar. They did superb work at Cydonia, and using the resources of Silicon Valley, the IMET was primarily a manifestation of early Silicon Valley talent, and we validated their work. We reproduced all the images, and then we started doing an in-depth study of Mars to see if, for instance, did Mars have an Earth-like climate in the past? And what happened to Mars to make it like at present? And in the process, of course, we not only found out all sorts of interesting relationships among objects in Cydonia and found every possible picture, including pictures of sunrise showing the face illuminated from the other side.
But at a much lower resolution, of course.
At much lower resolution, yeah, but at least we had, and it confirmed it was right-left symmetric. And but the really exciting thing is we discovered this thing looks like it was on the seashore of an ancient ocean. So then, of course, we validated all this, and then we charged off to the case for Mars 2 conference and presented it there, and everybody loved it, except for Mike Malin, who had the paper right next door.
Well, I mean, think of
he was madder than a wet hen, too.
Think of his position. He's an official principal. I guess he was a co-investigator in those years.
Yeah.
And he's basically been tasked with not letting anybody know what's really there.
Yes.
And in the booth right next to his, what are called poster sessions at these scientific conferences, we were presenting. I think we had Bill Beatty do the presentation. He was a geologist from.
He was actually. I got the honor because I had the loudest voice, I guess.
Oh, okay.
And one of the this really regal-looking character with a white mane of hair named von Putenkammer was there.
Oh, my God, was Jesco
there? And he was glaring at me. Everyone else was grinning at me and listening with great interest, and this guy looks like an old Prussian lord is just glaring at me.
Do you know the story?
I glared right back at him.
Well, good for you. Do you know the story of Jesco von Putenkammer? The real story. Well, Jesco von Putenkammer was an unrequited Nazi.
Oh my God!
who wound up working at NASA headquarters in charge. Get this, John, in charge of future NASA exploration missions. His job was to sketch out for.
Their master race will settle all the other planets.
Well, yeah, and he wound up dating Nichelle Nichols, and that was in the time frame that Gene Roddenberry of Star Trek lore and I were discussing the first major motion picture. Well, Jesco somehow found out, through Nichelle probably, that Gene was considering me as science advisor for the film, for the Star Trek the Motion Picture, the first motion picture after fans had worked for a decade to get this thing from TV, rescue it, and put it on the big screen.
I was just watching it yesterday.
Yep, with the one with V'ger, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yeah, it was a great movie.
Anyway, so Gene and
he was dating Nichelle Nichols. Now I'm jealous of him. Now I know why I was really mad at him.
So, yeah, Jesco dated Nichelle, and Nichelle obviously told him what Gene and I were doing. Well, he went in and apparently made such a fuss at Paramount and basically blackmailed Paramount and Roddenberry that if they chose me as science advisor, there would be no help from NASA on any aspect of the film. And Gene called me up and he says, "I'm sorry, Dick, but that's all they wrote." So I did not wind up science advisor on the first Star Trek movie, but I do have an enterprisemission.com website.
There you go.
Anyway,
you got your own enterprise.
So you presented the paper in lieu of Bill Beatty at that first Denver Mars conference.
That's right, and I presented it finally straight at von Putenkammer, thinking to myself, you were probably a peasant on my family's estate back in old Germany.
Well, that's one way to. That's like they used to say when you.
No,
they used to.
It was almost a farcical. Here's this guy glaring at me, like he wants me to be quiet, and everyone else is obviously enjoying my talk, and except for Mike Malin right next to us, who was trying to shout over me.
You know, it almost sounds like that scene from, what was it, Stargate. Remember the scene where the archaeologist is presenting the idea that aliens built the pyramids?
Yeah.
James Spader?
Yeah.
And he's standing there, and one by one they're leaving the room. Well, they didn't leave your room, did they?
No, they did not. They crowded close, and I would hold forth for 20 minutes. It was an odd mixture of poster and oral presentation. I actually liked it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we firmly planted the idea of an Earth-like Mars past in everyone's mind, especially in ocean. In fact, Hal Mazursky was one of the people who was grinning ear to ear. Here he's standing beside von Putenkammer.
Oh, really? That's fascinating.
Grinning from ear to ear. Putenkammer is glaring at me, giving me the double fisheye. I'm giving it back to him.
Well, you're giving away the Nazi secrets. They know what's up there. Have you ever talked?
We got the secret U-boat bases.
Have you
on Mars.
Have you ever heard of or talked with a guy named Richard Dolan?
No.
Okay. Dolan writes on history, and he's done a compendium, a very interesting compendium on ufology going back, I think at least to the 20s, maybe earlier. But he well. He came up.
It kind of started with the big airship scare of the late 1890s.
Yeah, the Aurora incident where something hit the water tower and crashed, and there was actually a body. Anyway, this is a digression.
We're back to Mars. To Mars. And Nichelle Nichols.
By the way, did you hear?
I had a crush on her when I was growing up. A young lad.
Did you hear the story?
Raquel Welch were my two teenage crushes.
She's now 82, but she doesn't look it. And I saw a story today that she's going to be going up in the NASA Airborne Observatory, the Sophia Observatory, which is basically a flying telescope built into the side of a converted 747. And she's going up, I guess, as some kind of a mission specialist because it's the closest thing that at 82 she can get in terms of the Enterprise.
In space, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so anyway, so let's move on from that conference because a huge amount happened after that conference where we presented.
It sure did. For one thing, our abstract disappeared from the official record.
Of course.
Of course. We were airbrushed out just like a errant cosmonaut. From the, in the Russian cosmonaut lineup, there was one cosmonaut who disappeared, apparently.
From the old Soviets, yes.
From the old Soviets, they had the airbrush department was put in charge of getting rid of pictures.
So
it happened to us.
It was standard technique, John.
The seed was planted.
John, it was standard technique to get rid of history that is uncomfortable, that you don't want to face, that you don't want, pun intended, that you don't want to confront. So, of course, they lost our abstract, and of course they lost the papers, and of course they got rid of any of the imagery. And, of course, I mean, this was in the era before the Internet. I'm sure they would have had minions out trying to scrub the web and scrub social media, but we're light years now past. We've got the Curiosity mission on Mars showing us stunning ruins and artifacts and broken up machinery with almost every shot they send home. We've got missions to comets. We've got missions to Ceres. We have a mission to Pluto, all of which are showing evidence of former extraordinary habitation. And I guess, John, we
we have to look at everything we see now with new eyes.
Absolutely.
After finding this massive archaeology on Mars, and I agree with you, some of the Curiosity pictures look like possible archaeology on the ground.
Yes, there's no more, John, there's no more possible. There's no way that those mechanical, broken, metallic flanges and
oh, yeah,
fittings
I've seen some of the pictures.
Yeah,
they're difficult to explain geologically.
You can't. The time for weasel wording is over. It's over, other guys out there. We've won. So now the question is, what do we do with it?
We have won.
So what we need to do is to move into analysis mode, which is what we're going to do after the break at the bottom of the hour. I want you to kind of leap ahead in time, and I want you to talk about your latest book, because we'll then back into Cydonia and some of the reasons why I don't exactly agree.
All of the original issues were actually raised in the image, as it turns out.
Issues like?
Well, for one thing, I was working at a nuclear weapons lab at the time, Sandia Labs, and that was I was standing in line to use the Xerox machine. That's what we did in those days, rather than search the internet. And I was talking. I had a copy of the results of the Viking expedition, a big tome of scientific articles about Mars. And I was mentioning to one of the people in line how the Mars isotopes were very strange, that they had this abundance of xenon-129 that was so different from Earth and so different from the solar wind or anything in meteorites. And I happened to have just been speaking to the right person, apparently, because he said, xenon-129, let me see that. And then he looked, and this is detailed in the book, he looked at the book, looked at the table of data, and he just looked at me and said, someone nuked them. And then he suddenly realized, and this happened at Sandia, we were in an unclassified area, and he suddenly set down what he was going to Xerox at the machine and just kind of nodded and said, I'm sorry, I have to go. And then he left. He just left the line, left the library. And what I realized is he had said something that possibly was classified at the time. And
he thought better.
Was part of the lab that was analyzing the atmosphere to look for stealth nuclear tests. One of the things they were monitoring, apparently, is xenon-129.
My guest is John Brandenburg, live tonight on The Other Side of Midnight. And we will be back. We will be back, yes. In a little while. We'll be back. So keep it right there. And we are back. I'm talking with John Brandenburg, who is a plasma physicist, experienced in the ways of nuclear weapons technology, and he was telling us about a conversation he had at Los Alamos where he was doing some Xeroxing, and he showed some data to a colleague of his related to Mars, and the colleague said, "Oh, that looks like the signatures of a nuclear weapon." Is that right, John?
That's right. Actually, it was at Sandia Labs down in Albuquerque.
Okay.
And but same kind of environment, and they had people there who were actively monitoring the atmosphere for signs of nuclear testing. And one of the things that has changed about the Earth's atmosphere since 1945 is a big spike in xenon-129, apparently
because of all the
nuclear explosions.
All the nuclear tests.
Yes. And also plutonium production, apparently.
See, I don't remember during Viking itself when those results came in. JPL had a lot of press conferences, and people were telling us this and telling us that, and looking at images, and even the face came out. I don't remember anybody on the science team of Viking saying at any point, this is a very weird isotope because it's primarily found on Earth as the residue of nuclear weapons.
No, they would not have said that. They were trying to run a tight ship.
So
and,
when did
but
you?
I believe that part of at least at some level, the U.S. government was aware of the possibility from Viking of a dead civilization on Mars, obviously because of the face, and then because of the xenon-129, they were aware of the possibility there had been a large nuclear large nuclear explosions on Mars.
See, the other day I saw somebody publishing something on the whole cold fusion controversy, and that's still going on.
Yes.
And this individual was saying, well, I can't believe the calorimetry, I can't believe this, I can't believe that, but if we had real nuclear byproducts, then I'd believe it.
Oh, yes.
Well, on Mars...
That's the smoking gun. That is the smoke from the gun.
On Mars, we've got the smoking gun. Something bizarre at the level of physics, fundamental nuclear transmutation, took place on Mars that has not taken place on Earth, on Venus, on Titan, on any of the atmospheric planets that we've sampled.
Unique to Mars.
Mars is unique, so what's the backstory?
Well, apparently, if one digs deeper, one finds, because of the new data, that there are two large radioactive scars on Mars. One in Mare Acidalium, which is near Cydonia, and the other in a place called Utopia Planum, which is a smaller radioactive scar. And those are apparent in two long-lived isotopes. One is thorium, the other one is potassium.
Now, hang on a second. What is your data source for knowing that we have two radioactive areas on Mars?
These are the gamma ray spectrometer readings done during, I believe it was Mars Odyssey.
Okay.
Had really beautiful gamma ray spectrometry, and basically the Mars atmosphere is so thin that the gamma rays from radioactive isotopes on the surface can come up right through the atmosphere and you can read them. Now, before the Russians had orbited gamma ray spectrometers, they picked up a lot of uranium and thorium and potassium on the surface. And this was very strange because by then we had Mars rocks and they were all depleted in uranium, thorium, and potassium.
Yeah, but wait. The Mars rocks are presumably from the surface.
Right.
And
or slightly below the surface.
Yeah, and the sources of uranium or thorium or whatever would be deep in the mantle and would come up around volcanoes, and if you don't land near a volcano, the odds of picking up something that actually came up through the mantle is pretty small.
Well, we have rocks from an object which are presumably in the near surface layer that show much less uranium, thorium, and potassium than Earth rocks, about 1/10.
You're talking.
Surface shows Earth level normal.
John, you're talking about the Mars meteorites that made their way to Earth and have been picked up in deserts in the Antarctic and all that.
We do have samples of Mars, and they have less of these elements than Earth does. Yet the surface apparently has the surface layer, the very top layer of the surface that would give gamma rays that would shine out into space, apparently is enriched in these these radioactive elements. This means there's a thin surface layer on Mars that is full of uranium, thorium, and radioactive potassium.
In other words, we're talking radioactive fallout.
Yes.
On a planetary scale.
And you can see from the maps.
So hang on.
Global debris pattern.
Let me get this straight. You're saying that the rocks, the meteorites that come from Mars, don't show the large anomalies of uranium, thorium, potassium, whatever, because those are rocks from the real surface of Mars. But the analysis with orbiting spacecraft of the gamma rays currently emitted by the Martian surface are showing us areas where these elements are very concentrated, and you're saying it has to be in the dust, i.e. fallout, because it's a local regional phenomenon, but pretty big on the scale of a planet.
That is true. I agree with what you just said.
Okay.
So there are localized hotspots on Mars, and in fact, then kind of like rays coming out of that, like the rays of Copernicus on the moon, spreading around the planet. They finally go around. It looks like a planetary shock wave came out of the one large area and wrapped around the planet and collided with itself on the far side at the antipode. So there's another small pile of radioactive debris where on the exact opposite side of the planet from Mare Acidalium, where the big one went off. And there's no crater. There's no crater at either of these sites. So what happened, apparently, is something went off in midair. We also now have meteorites that show they were irradiated by neutrons, high-energy neutrons.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the evidence adds up. I mean, we not only have a smoking gun, we have powder burns, we have shell casings, and we have rifling on the bullet. I mean, it's, somebody used apparently a large nuclear weapon on Mars because the Xenon-129, as it turns out, and I show this on the published on the website lifeonmars.pub and also in the book.
Yeah, we have a number of your websites listed.
It's not produced by a regular nuclear reactor. It's only produced by fast neutron events, such as nuclear weapon detonations.
Okay.
So you can't even have a natural nuclear reactor to explain.
You mean like the Gabon reactors they've discovered in Africa?
Yes. In fact, that was, you'll forgive me, that was my earliest hypothesis.
Oh, really? You thought you were dealing with a natural nuclear chain fission reaction?
Well, the mind kind of recoils from the idea that somebody dropped two massive nukes on a planet.
But, John, we talked about it 30 years ago.
Well, that was
our conversation.
The Cold War. We were getting ready to drop nukes on ourselves. It was very thinkable at the time.
Yes.
But after the Cold War ended, we kind of, let me put it this way. I got papers into conferences talking about natural nuclear reactors because they had happened, and everyone knew they had happened on Earth, and this was considered highly interesting. And I used the same data set. The problem is, as I found out from giving the papers and talking to people, is that a nuclear reactor, a moderated nuclear reactor with slow neutrons, which has to occur if it's going to be a natural nuclear reactor, doesn't make any Xenon-129. It's only a fast neutron event.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It's the forensics.
Because that means it has to be a weapon.
It had to have been a weapon. It could not have been a natural event.
Now, when you said a bomb, are you talking about one explosion? I mean, the Soviets built...
Apparently two large explosions, one huge one in Mare Acidalium, and apparently it was above the ground. It did not leave a crater. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki were airbursts.
Right.
They didn't do it for humanitarian reasons. Either they did it to maximize...
Oh, absolutely. No, with an airburst, you get shock waves, you get
much more effective shock waves, and at the same time, you don't get a crater. And the same thing apparently happened on Mars. What we have also found...
Well, now, hang on, because you're saying two bombs? How do we know it wasn't a whole bunch of smaller ones in an exchange?
Well, they're quite localized to.
Well, if you had two regional high-tech civilizations on Mars, not the original guys, not the folks that built Cydonia, but much later.
All of this is possible.
In other words, if someone on Mars survived the catastrophe at 65 million years ago in our model, and then rebuilt like we rebuilt civilizations here on Earth, you have this rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. I mean, that's part of the.
That's all of this is possible.
So we could be looking at a much later, maybe circa 30,000 years. The reason I'm asking this is, given the strength of the gamma signal from the Mars Odyssey instrument. This was the Russian instrument, right?
Well, no, these were there were earlier instruments on the Russian probes, the Mars probes during the 70s.
Yeah.
And the Russians are very good at nuclear stuff. So people I talked to said, yeah, we put a lot of store by the Russian results, and then this paradox developed because they got Mars meteorites in the 80s, and they didn't have any uranium and thorium.
So it's got to be fallout. It's got to be something superficial.
Got to be a thin surface layer on the surface, not in the rocks.
So what I was going to ask is, in the gamma ray data, is there any indication of half-lives, like when this nuclear event?
That's a very important question, Richard.
Thank you.
Yes, there is.
Good. What is it? What's
that?
I said, what is it?
It says it happened a long time ago.
How long?
Oh, 500 million to maybe 250 million years ago.
What?
The reason, yes, I know. It's all Richard, this is very confusing. It's, we have evidence of this murder that occurred.
You mean the murder of Mars?
That happened a long time ago because the isotopes that show this have to have are ones with very long memories. If you make potassium, for instance, if you set off a nuclear weapon over a desert and it activates the potassium from potassium-39 and absorbs a neutron to become potassium-40, which decays into argon-40, then it stays radioactive for about 1.2 billion years. It stays radioactive for a long time.
Okay.
Thorium also stays radioactive. All thorium is radioactive, and it has a half-life of 10 billion years. However, silicon, iron, all of these other isotopes that they measured don't show this pattern. That means whatever happened, all of the shorter half-life stuff is already decayed. All that's left is the very, very long-lived stuff with a memory like an elephant. So that enables us to determine that what happened a long time ago.
Okay, are you sure?
Even before the dinosaurs on Earth.
Well, yeah, the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. If you're talking
so this is much older.
Like 500 million, is that what you're saying?
500 million to 250 million, perhaps.
500 million years. Okay.
Or 250, somewhere around in that range. Well,
do you remember our initial estimates of the age of Cydonia, based on the alignments?
Yes, I do, and those were like in the 100,000 year.
Yeah, those were 500,000, 500,000.
500,000,
and that was an astronomical. But this, go ahead.
This is much older, and but the problem is if you have the interpretation that it was one large weapon in Acidalia near Cydonia, and then the winds would have carried all the fallout and the strongest shock wave. Prevailing winds carry the strongest shock wave and the fallout to Cydonia. The other one apparently goes to what I used to call Utopia. By the way, after the conference, after we discovered two possible faces there, I remember we argued about that. They renamed the place Galaxis Chaos, which, if you look in the Latin, means milky, broken ground. But I knew what it meant. It meant that somebody's galaxy had been thrown into chaos.
That's not a bad interpretation.
And we got new pictures from Galaxis Chaos. I called it right, Richard. We got at least one face and probably two faces there. One of them looks just like the Cydonia one.
Well, there's a lot of controversy around how many faces have been discovered as part of
I
NASA's.
know. I'm claiming just basically two, but it's all interpretation. Now this nuclear data, basically what we have, Richard, now, two completely independent lines of evidence pointing to intelligent activity of the worst sort on Mars in the past. I mean, my interpretation, and by the way, I don't want this to be famous last words, the Cydonia civilization looks, and the Galaxis civilization, they look like they were primitive civilizations, but I know better than to really believe that. We have to go up there and dig.
Absolutely. Well, look,
I mean,
nothing.
I don't really know what the level of civilization there. It looks primitive based on our earthly reference, but we could be completely misreading it.
Absolutely.
We have to go up there and dig. We have to send people up with picks and shovels.
So when you were assembling the book, the strongest piece of evidence in favor of an ancient, I mean, that's really ancient, 500 million years.
I know.
I'm fascinated that you can do the isotope curves and come out with that date. And my question then is, what kind of assumptions?
It's a rough date.
What kind of assumptions go into that date? In other words,
well, the assumptions that that if you look at the maps of radioactive iron and silicon, which have much shorter half-lives, in the million-year range, they don't show this global debris pattern and the two big hotspots at Acidalium, and they basically show where the lava flows are and things like that. Where do you have a lot of iron?
See, the question I'm having, and I wanted to not really get into it till we get to the top of the hour because I want to have an uninterrupted time, but in addition to a nuclear exchange of weapons like we know how to build,
right,
there's a whole other panoply of technologies that actually are operating at the atomic level. I'm thinking of the torsion physics work of Kozyrev and Shipov,
yes,
and those folks.
Their new physics.
Well, yeah, because for instance, John Patterson, who was a cold fusion guy out of Florida, did a live demo on Good Morning America, which I saw and I taped. I've got the tape, and I've actually put on Enterprise, enterprisemission.com. I put some stills from that stunning demonstration that Patterson carried out. He was able to basically collapse 4.5 billion years of nuclear fission in uranium samples into 20 minutes. He was able to decrease the half-life emissions in 20 minutes that normally would take 4.5 billion years in a studio in New York City on television. Now, if that technology exists in that primitive form to totally change the isotope ratios, could that same technology 500 million years ago or a lot sooner, because you can't use the old calculations and the old curves to plot a time sequence, because if you introduce new physics, all the old data and all the old models have to go away.
Richard, we both know that once intelligent agencies are involved,
you mean ours?
Intelligence agencies on Earth. I mean, intelligent actors on Mars are involved.
Okay.
Possibilities just explode. I have taken patterns that fit what would happen if nuclear weapons that we know how to build were built as big as the Empire State Building and dropped on a planet from space. They would give these sorts of effects.
So we're talking a super mega weapon.
Right. We're talking
how many megatons?
Megatons.
A billion?
Yes.
That's equivalent to the objects that impacted Jupiter, Shoemaker-Levy 9.
Yes. This is almost like a Chicxulub type asteroid impact, only it's a nuclear weapon.
Well, but is it? See, my question is, if you have a planet buster technology
Yes.
This is back to Joseph Farrell's work. If you have a technology which can selectively change the constants at the atomic level to either accelerate fission or fusion or retard it, you can create any nuclear effects you want as signatures, as side effects, but the actual weapon is more akin to what was done, let's say, to the World Trade Towers.
Well,
have you looked at the isotope ratios of the dust from the World Trade Towers and seen all the anomalies there?
No. One of the things I try to observe, is economy of controversy.
Oh, you can only tackle one controversial thing per week?
Well, and I have tackled this big controversy on Mars, but at the same time, Richard, I will agree with you. I am applying only weapons technology. When I went to school, to study how to make controlled thermonuclear fusion using magnetic fields, like tokamaks, things like this. Mm-hmm. I worked at Livermore. That's what I got my thesis in. And incidentally, I got my thesis studying under the late Richard F. Post, who is Marky Post's father.
Oh.
Used to be on Night Court.
Yep.
Lovely woman.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, and
small planet.
Passed on. But he was a very great man, and so I worked for him. But before I did that, I actually worked on laser fusion, which meant I worked down in the laser fusion is a miniature hydrogen bomb, basically. So they use a lot of bomb physics in it. So I had to get an informal education in how to build a nuclear weapon, basically, while I was doing that work. And basically, that's where I picked up some of the basic ideas of nuclear weapon operation in my educational background. But I never thought, when I started working with you on the Emmett investigation, I didn't think any of that would be useful. Little did I know.
Well, John,
what I have done, Richard, is I have taken what are known processes that we could do that could cause these effects. But, of course, if we have intelligent, extraterrestrial intelligence operating of unknown technological capability, obviously all sorts of other scenarios are on the table. The scenario I have proposed in the book, by the way, is not simple. I said it looks like the civilization on Mars, the Cydonia civilization, Galaxis, was primitive, and somebody came along and nuked them for no apparent reason except maybe to squelch them from being competitors in the future. This was proposed by Edward Harrison.
But John, why do you keep thinking that these civilizations were primitive? I know during the investigation, the Independent Mars investigation, we started from kind of Lambert Dolphin's pet prejudice, which was Egypt. His office.
Yes, and obviously Lambert persuaded me that if they're building pyramids, they're obviously primitive, John.
But see, that's not true.
But I still tend to. I guess I say people who build stuff like this on Earth, and I'm using just an Earth reference, which is, I freely admit, is a limiting point of view. This looks like archaeological stuff from primitive civilizations on Earth. And, I'm embarrassed to say, if I see this on Mars, my first assumption is they must have been primitive, like the people who built the stuff, like the pyramids and the big faces. The Olmec heads are a good match, by the way, to the faces on Mars. Mm-hmm. Faces and helmets. And in fact, we even found...
But why? See, it seems to me that you're kind of suffering from what we would call, if I was Carl Sagan, which I'm not, terrestrial chauvinism.
I will admit this.
You're projecting back.
Terrestrial chauvinism.
Yeah, you're projecting back. Because remember, the architectural art forms that we see from the Mayan, the Sumerian, the Egyptian are done by a, quote, primitive Bronze Age culture, but they could have been imitating the external appearance of much more advanced technologies expressed in local materials and local
that is certainly
techniques.
True. That is certainly
Because
true.
whatever we're seeing on Mars, John, was not primitive. Absolutely no way was it primitive. It may have been very sophisticated, but with an artistic line that has followed down through the mythos between planets, because obviously in our model there were refugees. And
or there were you can postulate a Jungian subconscious kind of connection between Earth and
absolutely. Or reincarnation.
Reaching out over the years.
Yeah, what if we are Martians and we literally reincarnated here after the experience there, and we're living out whatever our future game.
And I'm really sore at somebody. Governor Tarkin and Darth Vader blew up my planet, and I'm going to get even.
So at what point...
He asked me why anyone would do this to Mars, and I said, because Tatooine is too remote to make a good example. Quoting,
but see,
paraphrase Governor Tarkin.
If we're not dealing with conventional nuclear physics, that means you can't trust your decay curves to tell you the actual date. All you know is that something...
Let's say if we make... Let me put it this way. You approach... This is a science fiction scenario. Richard, we're living in a science fiction movie. I mean, we've already been to the moon. We have a space station. Those are science fiction movie things.
Did you hear what Alan Stern...
We've discovered a dead civilization on Mars.
Did you hear what Alan Stern said about Pluto last week?
He said Pluto is more important than Mars?
Yes, but he also said Pluto has a, wait for it, science fiction surface.
Oh, well...
So what does
the kind of science fiction he's interested in.
John, you don't know that.
Where are the harem girls?
Look at the maps they've created. They have populated the New Horizons team, and I'm going to talk about this with my guest on Thursday morning. They have populated both Pluto, the so-called planet, which is 1,500 miles across, 2/3 the size of our moon.
Yes.
And they populated Charon, which is its big moon, 750 miles across, about half the size.
On the river Styx, by the way, if you read your Dante.
Yeah, well, they populated the surface features so far, all with science fiction and ancient symbolic and godlike religious deistic names.
I was looking at some of the names. That some of those are quite interesting.
It's stunning. Anyway, we're going to pick this up when we come back from the other side of the break. My guest is Dr. John Brandenburg, and you are on the other side of midnight. Side of midnight. If I turn the pot up, it actually works. All this technology, John, it's like I'm flying a small starship. You should see this office. There are twinkling lights and selectors and mixers and cables and computers and screens. And anyway, I want to get into what made you write the book, because I know doing things quietly behind the scenes, kind of figuring stuff out, is one thing, but it's another to take a major stand in a major publication that will live forever.
Yes.
And make certain assertions. So what got you from the, God, this really looks weird, to, I got to put it down in print?
Part of it was when we discovered this, we reported, Vince DiPietro and I were working together up in near NASA Goddard, and he had retired from NASA. And he had come to work for the same for me, actually.
Oh.
So we were doing fun stuff like making ball lightning for the Air Force. We weren't supposed to call it ball lightning, but that's what it was. So, and he's a very capable fellow.
You mean you were playing with your lightsabers?
Exactly. In fact, it even sounded like a lightsaber. It had the same sound, that kind of humming sound. But anyway, basically, what happened was I discovered that they didn't have the xenon data. I thought the xenon 129 was present on Venus. And then I checked the data. I was just always reading articles, and I found that they actually hadn't been able to measure that on Venus. So their suddenly I thought, so Mars is truly anomalous. And also they'd gotten data from Jupiter, and it matched Earth. The Xenon 129 was at the same level as the Xenon 132, just like everywhere else in the solar system except Mars.
John, do you remember back during Viking, one of the things that we discussed as part of our... We had the first computer conference. I've got to track down Ren Breck and some of the other alumni.
Absolutely. Track down those guys.
Yeah, well, we might even...
And if you talk to Bill Beatty or Lambert Dolphin, if they're still around, please give them my very best regards.
I think Lambert is. I don't know about Bill. But I'm thinking part of our discussion was we're looking at photographs from Viking. We've assembled this computerized conference courtesy of Ren.
Yes.
And
give him my best regards.
His company. We're basically anticipating social media and Skype and all this other stuff by, 30 years?
It was so Silicon Valley. It was the primordial soup of Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So we're all over the country. In fact, some of us were outside the country, if I remember correctly, and we're shipping photographs around mechanically. We're actually mailing, photographing enlargements.
Oh, and Goddard Space Flight Center, the data center people there.
Oh, they were amazing.
Were cooperating. I mean, we were rebels up in the hills, and they were shipping us arms.
Yep.
At night.
So anyway,
sending us all these photographs.
As part of those discussions, remember how I asked the question? On every sci-fi movie I've ever seen, you go to another planet, you land, and what's one of the first things you do? The first thing you do, you measure for radiation.
Right.
They got a Geiger counter scene, and there's a close-up of the needle, and there's the click, 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 and
That's right.
Don't open the door. We got
one.
So Viking lands on Mars not once but twice. There's no onboard radiation detector. Remember? None.
I don't remember any discussion of that.
There was no radiation detector. Now, guess what? The 3 experiments, the biology experiments. If I remember correctly, 2 of them
did have
they relied on the measurement of the decay of carbon-14 to tell whether there was biology going on in the little incubated soil samples inside the lander, right?
Yes.
If the lander has no radiation sensing instruments on board outside, and it pulls a sample of soil from Mars inside and begins to analyze it, if the soil is radioactive, John, what did that do to the biochemistry experiments that relied on radiation? Because remember,
it would invalidate them.
Yeah, because there was no calibration that the radiation they measured came from the decay of carbon-14.
They also, though, they did have soil analysis using X-ray backscatter. They did have other. Remember, they also had. The Viking landers were nuclear powered. They had radioisotope generators.
Yeah, but those were sealed. Those were kind of sitting on
sealed.
Both sides, so you're not going to get those in the samples.
I think they did. They certainly had.
There was no radiation measuring gadget on either spacecraft. So and remember, the discussion I had at that time was, well, if, John, there's a nuclear war, remember I did discuss this with you.
Yes, I know.
How could it be that you could put instruments on a planet but you didn't measure the background to interpret the samples you were analyzing unless you understood that there could be other forces that were changing your readings?
Well, that would be pretty far out of the box for a lot of those Viking people. I mean, we're talking people wearing pocket protectors. And my joke is that
we all wore pocket protectors.
Driving along in the Curiosity rover, they spot a shiny rock and they get close and there's a Martian lizard sitting on top of it. And what do? They chase away the lizard with the robot arm so they can look at the shiny rock.
Of course, you got it.
I asked them why,
Look.
And the hard rock geologist,
in
charge of the mission says, because the rock will tell me more.
Do you remember one of the Star Treks, one of the movies, where 2 sisters kidnap Geordi and they're tapping into his visor? And they're eavesdropping, and they're looking for codes or something, and at some point they're so frustrated because one sister says to the other one, "This must be the only engineer in Starfleet that never goes to engineering." Well, Curiosity has exhibited the same dichotomy. It's the only spacecraft named Curiosity that I found that exhibits no curiosity.
That's because they recruit the drivers from L.A., Richard.
Oh, very funny. No, it's
and an L.A. driver, if he drives by some burning wreck with somebody wearing the Grim Reaper outfit, trying to wave down someone for help, that he will keep driving. In fact, he will not even look very closely at the flaming wreck beside the freeway.
Okay.
This is because he is an L.A. driver, so they recruit these people to drive those rovers.
I don't quite believe the story, but anyway, so you decided to put this theory, this massive, very controversial theory, that there was a
Well, here, Richard, I'll tell you one thing. We had, and I described this in the book, Vince DiPietro had a government tail on him all the time.
What?
Yes.
How do you know?
Because Washington, D.C. is a small town in these circles. So we're down at a Mars conference one day. We're standing there, and a fellow named Larry has accompanied us. He's a astronomy professor at a local community college. So he said, and he's standing there in the hall with us, and this Air Force colonel walks up in his dress uniform, blue, and dress blues, and he shakes Vince's hand. Apparently he knows Vince somehow and says, "Vince, you're doing a great job. Keep up the good work." And Vince introduces him to me. And then the fellow turns to Larry, our astronomy professor friend, and says, "Larry, how are things at the DIA?" And Larry is a real pro. He doesn't even bat an eyelash. He just says, "They're fine, Colonel. Thanks for asking." And I was working in the Strategic Defense, Reagan Star Wars.
So wait.
You mean with the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's another intelligence agency. But did Vince know that his astronomer friend was a intelligence operative?
No, he absolutely did not know.
Oh.
His eyes just about popped out of his head, and I actually waved my hand slightly, motioned to him to calm down. And Larry kind of disappeared after that. But now we knew who Larry was and Larry's mission. And you know what? Larry retired from working at the community college and started working for NASA in the building next to Vince. And when the Phobos mission went to Mars,
this is 89.
Vince called was going to the moon Phobos, and of course had an unfortunate accident at Mars that's never been fully explained. It took one last picture of something approaching it, and that they didn't publish it. They talked about it in Aviation Week, but didn't publish it. And then somebody said it must have been a fuel tank from earlier in the mission.
What?
That it followed the probe all the way to Mars.
That's nuts.
I know.
That is just so nuts.
It's ridiculous. But anyway, so Vince called the Russian embassy.
Why don't you describe the picture? What did Phobos photograph before it went silent?
A large cylindrical object
that looked like a big pencil sitting there in front of the spacecraft, right?
Something like I've seen one blurry picture of it. And they talked about this, and they said, "Oh, it must have been a fuel tank from earlier in the mission." And if you know anything about that, that meant it would have been jettisoned near Earth after the burn to Mars, and then would have followed the spacecraft like a lost dog all the way to Mars.
No way.
So anyway, Vince and I put this in the book. Vince called the Russian embassy to ask about the Phobos probe. We were hoping they were going to take pictures of Cydonia.
Of course.
And
well, wait. Did you see some of the infrared imagery that mission released?
Oh yeah, they had the thermoscan image.
Yes.
All the images, and they had some very good data.
And what was on the thermoscan data? Geometry. More damn geometry on Mars in the infrared.
I didn't see those pictures.
Oh, I'll send them. I'll send them to you. I've got them.
Send them to me. But what happened is Vince calls and he gets this very classic Russian guy on the phone whose name is Boris and says, I'd like to know what happened to your probe. Is there any more word? And the guy says, there's nothing wrong with our probe. Our probe is functioning perfectly.
And this was
and then
after...
he hangs up, and then, so Vince puts down the phone. The phone suddenly starts ringing. Vince picks it up. It's Larry.
Oh.
And Larry says to Vince, we monitor all those lines to the Soviet embassy. Don't call them again.
How could he tell an American citizen who not to call? Under what
Well,
Constitution?
Vince is technically working at NASA. It's a NASA phone. I don't know. So Vince characteristically called the Russian embassy again as soon as he hung up.
Oh, good for him.
But I'm just saying, so this Larry fellow was obviously working for the DIA, following Vince around.
Okay, now...
whatever he knew.
All right.
So we would pass on everything to him. And so when we found out that when all the Mars dots started to connect, I just called in Larry and said, Larry, this is what it looks like. And he took copious notes, and he sat there in the conference room at RSI with me Vince and I, for about an hour, seeing all of the data and our conclusions. And then he said, okay, I'll report this. And he did. And then through another fellow I knew in the intel community, who was an old friend of mine, came back the word. And as usual with the intelligence agencies, the answer to my question was itself a question. And the question was, why don't you publish? So I felt like it had been cleared for publication. So, and I felt, well, and in fact, Vince urged me, John, you have to publish this. We can't sit on this. So I immediately, in fact, since they found out about the natural nuclear reactors, I thought, well, the natural nuclear reactor story sounds kind of plausible. I'll publish that and see what the reaction is. And then I found out that I almost believed the natural nuclear reactor story myself. Until I found out that it doesn't produce xenon-129.
Xenon-129.
It's xenon-129. And at that point, Richard, I started having nuclear war nightmares. And I started staring a depression in the face. So I ended up diverting myself. The mind kind of, the idea, the scenario that is the simplest scenario, and let me put it this way. In my training as a scientist, we were always told to kind of make the simplest hypothesis possible using things that are known mechanisms. Unfortunately, people dropping bombs on people of hydrogen bomb standard designs, that's all known from Earth. So I put everything known that I knew from Earth together and applied it to Mars and came up with a scenario, a primitive civilization on Mars, that somebody came along, another spacefaring species, and nuked them. And that was such a dreadful hypothesis that it really started bothering me a lot. And so I wrote a book called Cosmic Jesus, just to get my mind focused on cosmic good. And then I decided, no, the time has come to write the book. And so I wrote it, and I prepared as well as possible, and I published it. And I also coincidentally published in Journal of Cosmology, and there were so many downloads on the article, the site crashed and has still, apparently they can't repair. I don't know what's wrong. Now you get forbidden. But anyway, that thing went through 1 million downloads. And I also went to an APS meeting. I also went to the Mars Society meeting and presented the anomalous explosions. I didn't mention Cydonia. I just said anomalous nuclear explosions on Mars, and let people draw their own conclusions. Everyone knows about Cydonia, who knows anything about Mars. And guess who showed up to listen to my talk?
Oh, this
Larry.
guy, Larry.
Larry.
Does Larry?
So Larry and I went and had a beer. I mean, you got to remember, I worked closely with the Pentagon and all these people. So these people are kind of my own gene pool. So, but, you know, so anyway, and then I presented at the APS meeting in Illinois.
Well, you got a lot of interesting and very positive press. It went on for weeks. In fact,
I know.
In fact,
I expected to be attacked from every side, but I had, you know, I applied every bit of training I've had as a scientist to try and put together the best possible case. And finally, you just say, "Here I stand. God help me. Here's the truth as I see it." And then I published the book, and the book has gotten good reviews. I've had one Mars blogger go after me.
who?
I challenged him. It's a guy named Stuart Robbins.
Oh, yes. Oh.
Well, I challenged him to debate. He won't debate me.
He won't debate you. Now,
Oh,
that's
he won't
interesting because he has challenged Barra to a debate.
Well, he should. You know, I've challenged him to a debate. He won't debate me.
Does he say why?
He basically told a third party he felt he didn't have enough expertise.
Wait a minute. He doesn't have enough expertise
to criticize
but
my
he
work,
can.
But he doesn't have enough expertise to. He's just a net troll.
He can. Well, yes, he is a troll. You know, I don't. Is he?
So anyway, so.
John, hang on. Is this the same Stuart Robbins astronomer who is attached to the New Horizons mission in Boulder at Southwest Research
of course
Institute?
He is.
That's the guy.
Yes.
He mentioned me and Keith Laney in connection with our Pluto discussions the other morning. Out of all the people and all the gin joints, etc., for some reason, he brings up us because we're discussing arcology's visible. John, you got to look at these Pluto images. Everything we've seen at Cydonia, which is in ruin, horrible ruin, is in such much better condition on Pluto, and the images are not the highest res. These are images that are nowhere near close to the Viking resolution yet, but they will be if, as I said at the top of the show, they show them to us. They've got to have them on the ground.
Probably, well, Richard, as somebody, you know, I was part of the Clementine mission, and
I meant to get to that.
No idea how much fighting occurs as to whose data gets downloaded first.
Yeah.
And
you mean there's no objective, quietly scientific, this is prioritized, this is going to be endangered?
You're talking about science on its best days.
Oh.
That on the best days of the year, scientists quietly and methodically and with intellectual detachment figure out whose data should be queued first. On the other 360 days of the year, it's a battle of personalities and who has more money, who has more seniority, who has more buddies on the upper management. You know, all of these things come into play. And
so it's the old boy network cubed, and it's an old boy network.
Old girl network too. So it's science. Well, I was learning all about science while doing the IMID investigation and working with you. At Sandia Labs, I was also getting a rough education in science, as I describe in the book. I saved the project. In the process of doing all the stuff on Mars, I was saving this project on direct energy weapons.
Mm-hmm.
I saved the project.
That's kind of ironic.
But I made a senior person embarrassed when I did it because I contradicted him and turned out to be right. So I saved the project and then was told that I should get the hell out of Dodge. Mars probably didn't help.
Do you remember? I mean, you have been immortalized, and in future centuries, you will be immortal
So
for
will
this.
you, Richard?
Forget that. I'm not the one that had the conversation I'm about to refer to.
Yeah.
Remember when you called Sagan before the presentation in Denver, and he said, "It's not whether you are right or wrong, sir. You're not even in the conversation."
Oh, that's right. He was quoting Wolfgang Pauli.
Oh, that was so stunningly.
And you're not even wrong, John.
Yeah, he was. Well, he was telling you basically.
He apologized for that later, by the way.
Oh, he did?
Yes, he did. He said, "Well, I was a little hasty." He says,
But
that was because the reason that happened is that Hal Mazursky came down after the conference.
Explain who Hal is.
Hal Mazursky was one of the science mission managers of the Viking expedition.
Yeah, a really great guy, super guy.
Really great guy, and he had looked for oceans on Mars
Yep.
and couldn't find any. He didn't feel. But he was sitting there grinning ear to ear at our discussion of a possible ocean on Mars. He came down to Sandia Labs, and I realize now he came down to talk to me. And he had lunch with me. And
Well, was this after '84?
This was just after our. It was like about a month after our conference.
That was the summer of '84.
Summer of '84. He comes down to Sandia and gives a little lecture on the next Mars mission, Mars sample return or something like this. And I show up because I'm interested in Mars. And he chat with him, and he remembered, and he says, "Well, let's have lunch." And so he tells me over lunch. He says, "We didn't know what to think about your pictures, but we really liked your ocean. Why don't you give a paper just on the ocean?" So.
Well, wait.
I did.
Do you remember, John? Do you remember, as part of our team effort, our conversations, I pointed out, because of the surface chemistry that had shown so much chlorine.
Yes.
And I said, damn it, if that isn't the evidence of an ancient ocean.
That's right. And, we had discussed all of this. I had said just by the landscape, it looks like there was an old ocean there. And, yes, you pointed out it was salty. It had chlorine in it. Because the Viking landers landed on what would have been the bottom of the old ocean.
Yes, the Dead Sea.
So anyway, we put that in the image.
The Dead Sea bottoms of Barsoom.
Absolutely, we're talking Barsoom here.
Yep.
And so he really liked that. So I actually presented a paper in '86 when I moved to Washington D.C. I quit at Sandia, went and spent 2 weeks on Maui, looking at Alpha Centauri, by the way, and I read this wonderful book by David Brin called Star Tide Rising.
Oh, yes. I want to try to get David.
On a galactic war triggered by a picture of a face.
David is an old friend of mine. I'm going to try
he wrote a superb novel, and I was reading it in Maui, and it was about this tropical planet, and it was just really, I just thought, gee, it doesn't get any better than this. So I got up at 4 in the morning, I was looking at Alpha Centauri, and I just finished the book, and I thought, well, and then I came back, I got a job in Washington, D.C., working on the Reagan Star Wars thing, which was space, even though it was military, it was still space. And so, but what happened in the meantime was Mazursky had urged me to do a paper just on the Mars ocean, so I waited for the next conference on Mars, and it happened to be right there in Washington, D.C., put in a paper on the Mars ocean. Sure enough, it got accepted. And there I was talking to an auditorium with about 3,000 Mars scientists in it about the great Mars ocean filling the northern plains.
You know that our model is a little different.
Guess what? They never give me credit for it.
What do you mean they never give you credit?
Oh, no. The people say, Malin and all those characters, they say, we don't know who came up with the Mars ocean hypothesis.
What?
No, but Wikipedia now gives me credit.
Well, that's
reference number 1 on the Mars ocean Wikipedia article.
Well, remember, the concept of a Mars ocean and the delineation of the isotopic signatures came out of the independent Mars investigation.
Oh, it did. And I point that out in the book.
I haven't read the book.
Cydonia was the origin of the Mars ocean.
Look, we're going to be back in a couple of minutes with John. John's going to stay over, obviously, and then we're going to try to open the phone lines, John. Obviously, we can't get to 1,000 of the things we want to talk about after 30 years.
I know.
So,
but hey, the HIMMET investigation which you organized was extremely fruitful.
You're just going to have to
saved
come back.
The human race.
Well, I appreciate that. So, we are going to take a break here.
The Cold War helped.
As we talk with John into the wee hours on the other side of midnight. Stay tuned.
Down on me, I got a little angel, set me free. Somebody's talking under their breath. Why think of dying while you're laying in bed? Somebody's trying to get over on me. I got a little angel, set me free. When the world is on my shoulder, my little angel climbs in, says move over. When the world...
And we are back on the other side. John, did you ever talk with Tom Van Flandern about any of this? Yeah.
Oh, okay. I saw the mute on. No, unfortunately, Tom and I basically worked on different aspects of the problem. You know, he was part of the Society for Planetary SETI, and a brilliant man, astronomer from the Naval Reserve. But we never really talked about any deep aspects of this. I think we chatted briefly at one conference, but it was SPSR is a pretty large group, and we rarely all assembled in one spot. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason I ask is because Tom, of course, was working, and our data tended to support his model. That quite a while ago, we're talking millions, maybe 100 million, 65 million years ago, the planet that used to orbit where Mars is now, the so-called fifth planet, blew up, exploded, and Mars, as one of its moons, was released into solar orbit, as was another moon, which he proposed blew up much later, something like 3.2 million years ago. And he...
is this sort of like the Phaeton?
Yeah, basically.
Hypothesis?
Yeah, and so what you have is a planetary system where, for some reason, planets tend to blow up after a certain point. And he had extrapolated this model into the outer solar system, and he used it just before his death, his very untimely death, to explain the existence of the Kuiper Belt, as he believed was the massive explosion of two Jovian or maybe Neptune, Uranus type gas giants, which scattered debris all over that huge outer belt, sent most of it to escape, some of it into the sun, and some of it in orbits that would periodically return, which is how he was able to calculate, using the celestial mechanics of the orbits when the event must have taken place, and that's how he got two spikes. He got one at 65 million and one at 3.2. My question.
I never studied that model very carefully.
Well, see, here's the reason it connects with your data. Mm-hmm. That process, as part of our research, which I could bore you with, and I don't want to do that tonight, in terms of measuring this physics, this background physics, the torsion field, if you violently change it, if you accelerate things, if you move things in a certain pattern, if you use plasmas in an elegant and very sophisticated way, you wind up getting transmutation. And if in the process of weaponizing this physics and technology you wind up blowing up your planet, then the decay curves of the isotopes thus produced may not resemble what we think of as conventional nuclear physics, because you're dealing with an abnormal physical process that's creating the energy release in the first place. And that's what I'm wondering if
Well,
that's
you know,
really behind what we're seeing.
I had the privilege of seeing some work by George Miley, doing cold fusion, and he starts out with electrodes of palladium or nickel and ends up with just a smear of isotopes all the way up to thorium
Yeah.
inside there. And I said, George, you're doing alchemy.
So if there is a
That's right.
John, if there is a physics that can radically change matter, and you
That's
apply
right.
it on a planetary scale to blow up matter, do you not
You'd hope that.
do you not get a weird skewed radioactive cloud of debris that's planetary,
Well,
but
you
in
can-
fact is not due to a nuclear process as we understand it in a bomb?
Well, I will simply say that George does not understand how this is occurring exactly. He has some hypotheses, but
You mean cold fusion?
the cold fusion, yeah. The cold fusion obviously is a real effect. They're seeing it experimentally. There's more and more evidence for it.
Oh, there's 30 years of data.
But I agree with you. It suggests a long range sort of nuclear force operating. Unfortunately, I guess let me put it this way. As a scientist, you see a bunch of dots, you see a bunch of data, and you find you can connect it based on processes that are known and that you have seen, including people dropping atomic bombs on each other.
Mm-hmm.
Then you basically you opt for an explanation in terms of known processes. I will always keep the door open to unknown processes.
But see, John,
At least when I put together the book and the hypotheses that I published, I was able to explain everything that we saw based on known processes and known techniques for making like a hydrogen bomb. But let me put it this way. When you get a lot of neutrons flying around, one of the things that people don't realize is we can actually use like the fusion neutron output from a tokamak nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
We can transmute nuclear waste from light water reactors and render it safe within 50 years.
And
Can
John,
actually accelerate
and
the transmutation of nuclear waste.
yeah, but John Patterson.
That's a known process to accelerate.
John
Yes.
Patterson, as I described in the last segment on Good Morning America, transmuted uranium-235 with a 4.5 billion year half-life in 20 minutes. Forget 50 years. 20 minutes.
Did he use an electrolysis apparatus?
He basically had a large glass bowl filled with tiny micron-sized beads, plastic beads, that were coated with a metallic film deposited on the beads in a vacuum. He then ran a current through the beads.
Okay, so he was using an electrochemical
He
process.
was using an electrochemical process, producing heat, anomalous heat, standard cold fusion anomalous heat, calorimetry. But for some reason, either by accident, serendipity, I don't remember the story, but he decided to measure the effect of the field around his reactor, which was the size of, a small coffee pot maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe 2 coffee pots. He found that the radioactive decay constants of radioactive samples in the vicinity of the reactor were suddenly dramatically changing.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so
Because
I'm
they
saying...
actually they discovered that some radioactive decay depends on the sun position in the sunspot cycle, apparently.
Well, this is from some guy that appeared on George's show the other night, Harrison. Maybe it was a guy named Bill Harrison, whatever. He's claiming that the cold fusion non-reproducibility is due to the sunspot cycle.
Well, that is people have. There's a published article in referee journals that talks about the variation in the decay product of one isotope that's very well characterized, and they discovered that the decay constant was varying with the sunspot cycle.
Yeah, this was the work of a guy at the University of Illinois, I believe. He also was involved Fitzbaum, something. He also was involved in the so-called search for the fifth force for a while, some years ago.
Oh yeah. There was periodically we look for a fifth force.
Yeah. Anyway, he was predicating his measurements that the isotopic decay constants, meaning the half-life, was changing depending upon the position of the sun in the sky in the year. That during the summer, the half-life of, I forget what isotope they were using, changed compared to the winter, when it was much, not much, but somewhat different.
The strong force, strong and weak forces which run nuclear decay, are supposed to be very short range. This would suggest there's a long range component to them. I have not.
Well, he was
one controversy at a time for me.
John, you got to drop that rule because there's too many wonderfully converging controversies. I'd like you to look at the dust, the radioactive dust from 9/11, and tell me what. See, there was a wild story after 9/11 that the Russians had somehow snuck in mini nukes and had detonated them in the basement of the.
Oh yeah, that's George Tenet.
But that's
the
nuts.
CIA director. Briefed the president.
By
the way, we were in Washington, D.C., and we were told that this is possible.
But see, that's also the indicator of a device that's non-nuclear that can change the atomic state of matter and produce all kinds of weird isotopes, but having nothing to do with the nuclear weapons technology that we're familiar with. And that's what I'm saying.
Why would anyone need to fly airliners into buildings if they already had that device?
Because it's a two-tiered problem. In other words, the attack was not against the United States. The attack was against the elite running the United States. It was a warning, if you don't do what we want, this is a theory, this is a model, a scenario, we will do more of this. Because the technology to bring down those buildings, if you read the work of Dr. Judy Wood, write this down, John, Dr. Judy Wood, look up her name, find her book. I was able to get a copy of her book to Jesse Ventura and a few other people a few years ago. She basically has written this amazing book called Where Do the Towers Go? And she proves from a materials science perspective that there are so many anomalies at the structure of the steel and the concrete and the other fabricated systems in those buildings that some kind of extraordinary anomalous energy had to be directed at them to produce the effects, and the airplanes were simply a plausible deniability excuse for those that need the plausible deniability excuse. In other words, if you're threatening the in-crowd with an awful new technology and you don't want the rest of the world to know you're threatening them with an awful new technology, you give them an excuse they can watch on television, the buildings falling, airplanes hitting, that kind of thing. That takes care of them, but the real guys inside that you want to get your message, what have they done since 9/11? We have acted like total scared children, John. Why are we, at every level of this government, terrified of a handful of insurgents half a planet away unless they're the tip of an iceberg of another force that is using this technology to warn the in-crowd they have to do what these invisible guys, whoever they are demanding.
If you put a handful of insurgents in charge of a couple airliners where the passengers have been conditioned to not do anything about the hijacking, then you have given people very, very powerful weapons.
But in this model, it's merely a cover.
Richard, we digress.
Yes, we digress greatly. I want to get a couple of calls in here.
The world is full of mysteries, and the mysteries of Mars. The mysteries of Mars.
But you see, I think they're related. If the technology you're seeing...
everything is connected in the end.
John, if the technology you're seeing is not conventional nuclear weaponry, then you have to explain the anomalies by a different spin, pun intended, of the physics. And
Well, I'll tell you something interesting. Most people do not understand how modern hydrogen bombs work. Everybody knows a hydrogen bomb is set off by a small atomic bomb, but they don't understand that what they do nowadays is they wrap the hydrogen bomb with uranium or thorium. And so when the hydrogen bomb goes off, it sends out all these very high energy neutrons, and the neutrons are such high energy, they actually split atoms of ordinary uranium and thorium, which are normally inert. So they double the yield of the hydrogen bomb and greatly increase its amount of fallout, radioactive fallout, by the way, simply by making the casing out of uranium and thorium. And that's also what produces all the xenon-129, apparently.
In terms of our conventional technology, but
in terms of present-day nuclear weapons. This is unclassified, by the way.
Okay. We've got some people who've been waiting very patiently. Why don't we go to the phones and see who wants to ask you what? You ready?
All right.
Okay, let's take Trey. You're on the air, Trey. Welcome.
Hey, Richard, Braps from Belgab. How are you?
Good morning.
I was curious. We've kind of talked about science fiction on and off throughout the evening, and I was wondering what were both of your influences that have led you into your fields and motivated you both. And we also want 3 hours. Got to get it in quick.
You got to.
Well, I'm going to have to make some more coffee. We're going to be 3 hours here, Trey.
Hey, we'll take 24 hours if you can do it.
Oh, thanks a lot.
You may never.
Trey, you're very kind.
So, John, how did you get into this? You were a straight nuclear physicist, and then something terrible happened, and now you wind up talking to Hoagland on the radio.
Well, I was working. One thing that happened to me, I was working on making a brighter, warmer future for humanity with controlled thermonuclear fusion, and suddenly I ended up that horse got shot out from under me, and then I ended up working on directed energy weapons at Sandia Labs, and that was a big shock to me. I mean, and Sandia Labs is a great place, but it is a hard nuclear weapons lab. I mean, their motto was no duds on doomsday. They made sure every bomb would go off. And they also, and you got to remember, it was also on the Air Force Base, so every morning I would go to work. This flight of jet fighters would be taking off. It was New Mexico Air National Guard, and they were first line to be sent to Europe if the great European war broke out with the Warsaw Pact. So the Cold War roiled naked around me, whereas in Livermore, where I'd gone to school, was kind of an abstraction. It's very nice. It's a very pleasant town outside the San Francisco Bay Area, and very much like a kind of a university campus. And here we're doing research on making controlled thermonuclear fusion.
What was that?
You can't get a job doing that once you get your degree. Instead, you get hired to do directed energy weapons. And so I was kind of in shock because of that. And my wife was much more liberal than I was, and I think it really affected her a lot too. Plus, the Cold War had become very intense. There was this sort of a feeling like, gosh, how can we get out of this big Mexican standoff? And then when the Imminent investigation started, and I was invited to join, I thought, well, if we found a dead civilization on Mars, that would help stop the Cold War.
You and me both.
Anyone who's raised small children, as I have, knows the best way to get them from doing something bad is to distract them.
Yep.
Look at this. Look.
Trey,
Oh, look.
Trey, have you got any other question?
Oh no, you
really.
did ask me what the science fiction thing.
Yes.
I read Dune.
Great book.
And let's see, that I really love that, and I write science fiction too. I wrote Morning Star Pass, The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up.
Put a link up there.
And named Victor Norgard.
I think, excuse me, I think all the links are on John's page. We've been having a problem tonight with the link connection to his actual web page, but it will be fixed. So you can go back in and look at all the links for all of John's books, and he's got many. They are linked up on his page at the other side of midnight, provided we can fix the page. So we will do that.
But anyway, Trey, I really liked Dune by Herbert. Also, Star Tide Rising, The Mote in God's Eye. Those are some science fiction novels that really.
Those are great.
Those are great, and I, as a science fiction writer myself, I tend to try and emulate those kind of slightly blood and guts, slightly trashy. Good science fiction should be. Somebody said the difference between science fiction and science is that good science fiction adds action, blood and guts, and sex to science.
Okay, we have now fixed, apparently, John's page. So if you go to othersideofmidnight.com and scroll down at the very bottom, there's 6 links, of various books John has written. You have been incredibly prolific, my friend.
Well, I was a single parent for many years, and so when
Death on Mars, The Discovery of a Planetary Nuclear Massacre.
Right.
Morning Star Pass, The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up, Asteroid 2012, Sepulveda, The Cosmos Plays Hardball.
That's the prequel to the Morning Star Pass.
Have you told Chris Matthews, The Cosmos Plays Hardball? Life and Death on Mars, The New Mars Synthesis, Beyond Einstein's Unified Field, Gravity and Electric Oh, that's what I need to talk to you about, and obviously we have no more time. Trey,
I have no more time. That's a different time.
I'm gonna good night you because we've got another set of calls coming in.
Thanks,
here.
guys. Good show.
Thanks, Trey.
Hey, Trey. Good talking to you.
So the number is 505-796-8802. It's on the top of othersideofmidnight.com on the right-hand side. 505-796-8802. Or if you want to call us directly on Skype and have that wonderful quality of sound, it is Enterprise Mission. That's our Skype name, Enterprise Mission, and we will answer anybody who calls. Obviously, you have answered every question. There's nobody calling at the moment. That's weird. Really weird. So any final thoughts? Because we've got about 5 minutes here.
Well, I basically assembled the data for Death on Mars over 3 decades. And I wanted to make sure I had the very latest imaging data from Galaxis Chaos, Sonia Menza. I tried to tell the human story of, why I, as a young scientist, would actually get myself involved with a band of pirates like the Emmett investigation, sailing the high seas. And I basically given it my best shot as a scientist. And I went and presented this stuff at the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference in Houston in this March. And I got I presented as a poster. They let me in as a poster. And the best and the brightest, I could tell, came to my poster and argued with me, and we went back and forth. And finally, nobody had any other explanation for the pattern of data on Mars.
Now, were there nuclear scientists in the audience?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And they looked at this isotope.
Finally, nobody. The Xenon 129. We have meteorites like ALH 8401, the ancient Mars meteorite, and there's another very primitive meteorite of lava rock called Chisigny. They show that the early Mars atmosphere was the same as Earth's as far as xenon isotopes. So this was early Mars was like Earth and like the rest of the solar system. Then something happened to create all this Xenon 129.
John, let me ask you
this. No
this.
one else has an explanation for it.
Well, let me ask you this, because when I would talk with Van Flandern about this, and in those years there was a lot of discussion about the isotopes and the measurements and the latest readings of atmospheric anomalies on Mars. At some point he pointed out to me, he said, Dick, how do they know that what they're measuring are rocks from Mars? How do we know it's not from the exploded fifth planet as part of the cataclysm that occurred when it blew up and Mars was released into solar orbit?
Well, the finding that we had meteorites in the meteorite collections from Mars is a long detective story, and it started out with some very rebellious kind of pirately characters like us in the Mars community, basically saying these rocks are from Mars. It includes, in fact, one of my favorite meteorites called Nakala, which is the only meteorite known to have killed a living thing on Earth, a dog, and it came from Mars.
Was that the one that fell in Egypt?
That's right, and it confirms that Mars has bad karma.
But
So,
see, John, what I'm saying, though, is Ben Flandern asked the very important question. If you have a planet
you
blow
know
up...
these stuff from Mars? Basically, that had... you know how you know it's got from Mars? Because it's full of xenon-129.
But the planet that blew up, if we're right, would have created an excess, an anomaly of xenon-129.
Well,
that's the whole point.
I know what. They actually have meteorites they believe are from Vesta, one of the main belt asteroids. And none of them show the xenon-129. The only place you find the xenon-129 anomaly is Mars rocks.
Well, John,
There are a few very primordial...
as you can hear, John, can you hear? We've reached the end of the program. You're going to have to come back. It was 2 hours, and it went like snow in the sunshine.
It did. Richard, great to have you. Great to be talking with you again. And, Richard, you did a good job.
Thank you, John.
You started the Inman investigation, and the scientific, as I say in the book, the scientific cavalry arrived at Cydonia, and it was a band of wily rebels. It wasn't from the government, but it didn't matter.
Until tomorrow morning.
You assembled a very capable team.
Thank you, John.
You did the job.
Until tomorrow morning, good night from the other side of midnight.
Very good.